the great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Douglas Coupland, Canadian writer, designer, and visual artist. Many parallel realities in his work. His work in all media contemplates new models of being created by broad shifts in technologies. His 2009 biography of Marshall McLuhan took McLuhan's ideas and helped relocate them in a 21st century arena. We had long discussions with Douglas in Dubai a few months ago about McLuhan, digital memory, forgetting. So it's wonderful that we can continue this here. Those reframed ideas now serve as jumping points into further explorations of the psychic trauma the human species undergoes with its ever-accelerating offloading of memory into the cloud and into vast memory storage systems. Coupland has published 13 novels and has written and performed for the Royal Shakespeare Company. For us tonight, Douglas will be talking about the cloud and information storage systems in his participation titled, This is Not a Cloud. A very, very warm welcome to Douglas Coupland.
Hans-Ulrich, thanks very much. I've got this weird voice that sometimes doesn't reach the back of the room, so if that becomes an issue, just raise your hand. Can't hear? Okay, sound guys will fix it shortly. A few years back, I got a copy of the Keith Richards autobiography, and my agent in New York had a copy of it as well. So we were talking, and I said, Eric, how far along in the book are you? And he said, 11%. And I think there's just been a change of epochs here going on. Haley, who is a trainer at my gym, she's 23, and the song Paperback Writer came on gym stereo system. And I said, so Haley, what do you think of the Beatles? Like, I burnt through them last week in 3 days. At a dinner the other night, we were talking about Rodney King, came up in the conversation, and a teenager in the room said, well, who's Rodney King? And we filled him in. Oh, right, he was the official YouTube of 1993. And sometimes this magical drug, I call it 9-penicillin. And if you take 9-penicillin, it's a magic pill that makes you feel like 9/11 never happened. Now, during this year's anniversary coverage of 9/11, two things came to mind for me. Number one is that nobody in Manhattan in September 2001 was holding an iPhone up and photographing anything. That it seemed to me that 9/11 may well go as the first underdocumented, or the last underdocumented mega event in our culture. It certainly points out that changes in what we remember and how we remember it. Number two is that people in 2001 looked pretty much exactly like people in 2011, 2012. The clothes, the hair, the car, there's nothing really to say that you were in one era or another. And I mention this because I think it's only in the last decade that we have entered a kind of universe where all eras coexist at once. It's sort of this weird world of atemporality. No particular look or style dominates the culture right now. Steampunk, it lives with disco, lives with the 80s revival. It's all sort of everything. And here's this line, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it. The zeitgeist of the 21st century is that there's a lot of zeit, but not much geist. And I'm kind of appalled I wrote that, but there is something very sparse about the present moment. You have optical fibers, carry 40 billion phone calls at the same time, soon 10 terabits a second. Basically, I want my Dexter season 4 and I want it now. And that's what seems to be driving all of this. Now, and also I muse upon this because we have 7 billion people on Earth and how pretty much everyone these days kind of voraciously devours every sort of unbundled fragment of our creative past, either in YouTube as a clip or maybe in a plastic bag you buy something off eBay. And it seems like we now create more, consume more culture than we create. And I'm wondering if everything before 2001 is going to be called the age of content, and everything since then will be called the age of devouring. Now, a few small things here. sometimes we all want a break from the internet. I know I do. Last December, I read a biography of George Washington because I knew there was no possibility of hearing about email or the internet in that book. I actually kind of like watching movies and TV from before the 1990s, because no internet, it's kind of like a form of time-based ecotourism. And I was watching people in Manhattan a few months back, and about 1 person in 3 is walking down the street, and they've got their device like this, and they're talking into it. And then I heard this thing that scientists said, which is that if you look at a crowd of people, basically 30% of them aren't really there. They're off somewhere else, and their bodies are basically on autopilot. So at least nowadays we know who's there and who's not by the device that they're using. I came over here on Lufthansa. And the thing about commercial aviation is that it was the last sacred place in our culture. It was the last place where you could have no internet. And then I got on this flight and I look up, and there's a little sign that says, ooh, Wi-Fi hotspot. So $29.95, I do it. And I felt kind of soiled afterwards. But what it did is it made a 9-hour flight go much, much faster. And I've noticed that time seems to be going a lot faster these days than it ever used to. And it's not because I'm getting older. It seems to be kind of a universal phenomenon that a year no longer feels like a year. In the 1990s, I thought we had entered an accelerating culture. And these days, I think acceleration is accelerating. Science has shown us that the average human attention span is about the length of one Beatles song, about 2.5 minutes, which is roughly when you're working at your desktop. Every 2.5 minutes, you, I think I'll go look at email, or, oh, what's that link? And you get distracted, and we've all done that. Time perception is very much about how you sequence your activities, how many activities you layer on top of each other, and the types of gaps, if any, that you leave in between them. Your brain actually needs gaps in order to recognize and process time. It's called interruption-driven memory, and in daily life, it's why you never remember the green lights you got while driving, only the red lights. Leaving small gaps of time between the things we do makes your life feel longer. It's because we go for such long periods of time now without maybe having buffer time in between the little things that we do, that perhaps time's going by more quickly. A year to your brain sometimes feels like 2.5 months. So basically, if you're in prison, you want time to go quickly, just stay online. And if you're having a really good patch in your life right now, maybe stay away from the internet, stretch it out. In 2012, sort of the ultimate cruel or snobby thing you can say to someone else is like, oh, I experience more time than you do. We were in Madrid last week for 3 days, but it felt like 5. Now, here's something. Memory, say you wake up in the morning and you go and you get a coffee, and then you go online, and you're online all day because it's a big project and you're crashing it. Then you go to sleep. Well, all the memories that you've had that day have been artificial. Your brain has experienced almost no official organic memory time of its own. Your whole experience was out there with the cloud. The more you take your memories from the cloud, and the more you use the cloud to remember all those things you used to remember, the more your memory becomes, in a very real sense, artificial. Now, and you also think having access to all this information would make us feel kind of godlike and omniscient, but actually knowing the answer to everything is almost kind of boring. And we're all kind of making this up as we go along. Google is currently wiring the city of Kansas City, Missouri with 1 gig per second of internet time. And they're not doing this because they want to be good corporate citizens. They are doing it because they don't know what happens to human beings if you give them 1 gig a second of information. For example, when they invented cars, who would have known that dogs like to stick their head out the windows? And who would have known when we invented the internet that 30-second long clips of cute kittens would suck billions of dollars worth of worker time and productivity out of the world's economy? Now, here's something else. Lately, I realize I've been making all these really appalling errors on my keyboard. I use a Mac MacBook Pro. And I'm a five-finger typer when it comes to the Mac, and I have an iPhone. I've been using my thumbs only, and it has autocorrect. And I think sort of the thumb typing part of my brain has started contaminating the keyboard part of my brain. And at first I thought I was getting like Alzheimer's, or like I was like HAL 9000 having his memory modules systematically removed. And, well, people today are basically kind of asking, I think, is cerebral outsourcing making us dumber, or is it making us smarter? And I think the thing about 2012 is that we're actually a lot smarter than we ever have been before. We just feel stupider. And, well, being able to look stuff up on Google and Wikipedia does free up long-term memory space in our heads. And I don't think Doug, calm down. I don't think that I no longer bother to remember your phone number actually indicates any level of stupidity. There's a lot to be said for selective forgetting. I'm glad I don't need to know your phone number anymore, because that phone number was occupying brain slots that could have been used to establishing a new recipe for world peace. But everything we're discussing here today would all be just merely interesting, except this change in our perception of ourselves being alive is not a transient state. It's actually a permanent new condition we've all entered, and never has an invention so quickly been adopted by the entire species, and then, once having been adopted, bent the species to its will. The servant has become the master. Books took centuries to bend us to their will, and the internet's been here for 15 years. And the cloud and handheld devices connected to it have not even been here for a decade. So thousands of hours of internet exposure is rewiring all of us at the core of our brainstem. Europe, Asia, Africa, everywhere on the planet, our neurons are firing together in ways that they've never fired together before. And of course, neurons that fire together wire together. And if you think this is sort of a trivial rewiring going on, just ask anyone with a child born after 2000, and they will tell you that the way that people think now is different. The medium has become the message. And once the internet colonizes your brain, it can never be decolonized, and speed and memory are all irreversibly addictive. I very much miss my pre-internet brain, but I also kind of like where my new brain's going, and sentimentalizing the 20th century brain's probably not going to help anyone. Now, sometimes I'll be outside the Safeway, and people have like tethered up their dogs outside the store, and those dogs are just sort of sitting there with that face, like, please, 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 please come back, my pack. And you think cats must walk by and just look at those dogs and say, what a bunch of losers. I think what happens is the cloud, the internet, whatever you want to call it, it polarizes us. One moment we're a dog, like, what did you have for lunch today? Show me a picture, like, must be with the pack. And then when we're off by ourselves, sort of feasting on information, that suddenly we oscillate between dogs and cats. And if you disagree with that, then ask if you would like to have all of your Google searches for the last decade printed in the New York Times. There's a maxim in the world of urban planning that if you let your city be designed by a baker, you will end up with a city of bakeries. If you live in a culture that is brains that are planned by books, you're going to end up with a citizenry that is book-like. If you have citizens whose brains are planned by digital culture and internet browsing, you're going to have a citizenry who want their lives to be simultaneous, fluid, to jump from link to link, a society that assumes that all needed knowledge is just there for the asking, which is very different from the culture of books. The act of reading books inculcates in readers a strong sense of individualism. Books are what gave us the individual. Books imbued in readers the logic of the book, which is linear sequencing, emotional through lines, morals, structure, climax, denouement. And the cloud and all its tools have changed our lives into merely a series of largely, purely, artificially memory-based tasks performed in a sequence. And the narrative flow of our life has been sort of stripped away in the process. And this, combined with the end of organic memory also means that life is just no longer feeling like a story. And overexposure to the cloud and culture and its information fluidity erodes our need for our lives to be stories. Our lives become denarrated. People steeped in the cultures of the 19th and 20th century came to believe that a life without a story is not valuable, whereas citizens of the 21st century are puzzled by that viewpoint. And I have noticed, though, that there's a residual need for life to be a story. It persists from the print era, especially I've noticed in people who were born before 1970 or so, which would be me. The internet has made us stop feeling like individuals and instead makes us feel like just one unit among 7 billion other units. And who's to say this is wrong? Being an individual may well be overrated. There are some scientists who say that individuality and the notion of individualism is a form of brain mutation, not evenly spread throughout the population, which is why there's always a battle between the secular and the religious. And 7 billion people is actually not very good for the planet or Mother Nature. In fact, it's much better for Mother Nature that everyone is inside downloading porn and watching puppy videos rather than being outside in the world wrecking things. Maybe the notion that your life has to be a story is just plain wrong. I mean, born, grew up, maybe had some kids, whatever. What kind of story is that? Maybe instead of our lives being stories, we just want our lives to be singular. So where is this going? Singular, the singularity. Some people think that the ultimate goal of technology and the internet is to convert the entire planet into one large system fully dedicated to the externalization of the human brain, the ultimate McLuhanistic expression. Some people call this the singularity, when everything we've wired together wakes up one morning and becomes this great big living sentient entity. Google is actually, they've been buying every book on earth, they've been shipping it off to the Indian subcontinent, and they've been scanning them. They even have these special algorithms that take where the paper goes into the gutter and it automatically straightens it out into a straight line of text. And they're not doing this because they want to provide books for all of humanity as a service. They're doing it so that when sentience emerges, it has data from which to learn about humanity and what it is we are and what we do. And I think it's kind of naive, though, to think that the singularity is going to be benevolent when it emerges and it's actually going to like us. In fact, a singularity, it might take a look at us human beings and say, you know what, I am out of here. Who are you? Your search history is the real you. When are you? You're actually at one of the most interesting periods in human history. And here's the thought. I used to think that the internet was a metaphor for life, and now, without being coy, I think that life actually may be a metaphor for the internet. Last April, I was in an optical fiber making factory in Shanghai, and I met this manager, and on the wall in his office, he had a picture of his 7-year-old son, and I asked him, well, what's the big difference between him at 7 and when you were 7 years old? And he said, oh, that's easy. He believes that the internet is the real world. And I got to thinking, well, probably about this point in history, half the world believes that the internet and the real world, the internet is the real world, and the other half simply has yet to come to that conclusion. All of tonight's proceedings have been shipped off to the cloud. Singularity, when and where you emerge. I hope this marathon helps you out. It took 5.5 billion years to get to you. You're basically every memory we've ever had. It's been a pleasure to be here in the pavilion. Thank you, Serpentine. Thank you all. And thank you, Hans, for having me. Thank you.